Death, as it turns out, involves significantly more paperwork than advertised. A celestial administrative office stretched across dimensions like the universe's most ambitious government building, all marble columns and floating filing cabinets that defied several laws of physics. Somewhere between the Department of Karmic Redistribution and the Bureau of Reincarnation Appeals, a processing queue snaked through corridors filled with the soft hum of cosmic bureaucracy at work. The beings manning the desks weren't quite angels, more like middle management with wings and an unfortunate tendency toward passive-aggressive sighing. They'd been processing souls for eons, sorting the deceased into neat categories, virtuous to paradise, wicked to various unpleasant destinations, and the vast majority to the standard reincarnation cycle. It was routine work, predictable as clockwork, until Q Station 847B received its most confusing case in millennia. As the worldwide media attempted to fake, the human female materialized with the distinctive pop of interdimensional travel, still wearing shredded combat fatigues and carrying the lingering scent of battlefield smoke. She blinked once, twice, then surveyed her surroundings with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to rapidly changing tactical situations. "Well," she muttered, noting the ethereal lighting and distinctly non-terrestrial architecture, "this is either the afterlife or the universe's weirdest USO show." Processing Agent Zephyrix, a luminous being with the personality of wet cardboard, consulted his dimensional tablet with growing alarm. The species classification code wasn't computing. Neither was the origin planet designation, or the theological framework reference number. "I'm sorry," Zephyr said in the tone of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "But what exactly are you?" The Marine raised an eyebrow. "Human. Homo sapiens. From Earth. You know, third rock from Sol, blue-green marble, terrible at intergalactic diplomacy." More frantic tablet consultation. Zephyrix's halo flickered with what could generously be called technical difficulties. "I'm not finding human in our database. Could you perhaps be a variant of Altarian? They're bipedal, carbon-based, occasionally violent." "Lady, I just got fragged by a plasma grenade while defending some godforsaken mining colony against buggerized freaks with too many teeth. I'm not in the mood for 20 questions about my species classification." The processing queue behind her had begun to back up. A recently deceased philosopher from the Andromedan Collective tapped his tentacles impatiently. Several warrior poets from the Rigel system started composing increasingly agitated death songs about administrative incompetence. Zephyrex's supervisor, a being of slightly more impressive luminosity and considerably less patience, drifted over with the weighted sigh of middle management everywhere. "Problem, Agent? Unclassified entity, sir. No theological framework on file. I can't determine proper afterlife assignment without knowing which pantheon has jurisdiction." The human snorted. "Pantheon? Look, pal, where I come from, we've got about 15 major religions, 300 minor ones, and at least half the population thinks the whole thing's made up anyway. File me under complicated and call it a day." This presented an unprecedented problem. The Celestial Administrative Office ran on cosmic precision. Every soul had a proper category, appropriate deity oversight, and designated afterlife trajectory. Freelance mortality simply wasn't accounted for in the system. After 20 minutes of increasingly frantic consultation, during which the queue stretched to what the philosopher calculated as roughly 17 parsecs, Zephyrix's supervisor made an executive decision that would later be classified as the most significant clerical error in cosmic history. "Processing code 777 divine," he announced, typing with celestial authority. "If we can't classify the species, we'll classify by combat effectiveness. This one's clearly warrior caste. Probably some forgotten champion lineage." "Sir," Zephyrix ventured, "code 777 is for divine ascension candidates. That's reserved for beings of exceptional cosmic significance who've demonstrated what? Combat prowess? Check. Death in service to others? Check. Unclear theological status requiring special handling? Triple check." The supervisor's patience had evaporated somewhere around minute 15. "Process the ascension. Let the Department of Divine Resources sort out the details." The Marine, who'd been following this exchange with growing amusement, held up a hand. "Hold on, ascension to what exactly?" But cosmic bureaucracy, once set in motion, proves difficult to stop. The processing stamp came down with authority that resonated across dimensions. Forms filed themselves in triplicate. Somewhere in the vast machinery of universal administration, gears turned and wheels spun, and a small but significant error cascaded through reality. The human felt the change immediately, a sensation like being plugged into the universe's main power grid. Energy coursed through her consciousness, expanding her awareness beyond any mortal limit. The office around her began to fade, replaced by the growing sense of connection to something vast and waiting. "What the hell did you just do?" she demanded. But her voice now carried harmonics that made the marble columns ring like bells. Zefric consulted his tablet one final time, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror. Oh no. According to this, you've just been assigned as a minor deity to, let me see, Kepler 442b. That's a Class M world currently inhabited by the Fluffington species. The what now? Highly religious, technologically primitive, approximately 2.7 meters tall, covered in what your species might classify as fur, with an unfortunate resemblance to your planet's rodent family. They've been praying for divine guidance for approximately 3 centuries. The marble floor beneath her feet had begun to dissolve into streams of light. The transformation was accelerating. Consciousness expanding to encompass not just her individual self, but something far more cosmic in scope. "You're telling me," she said, her voice now carrying the weight of divine authority whether she wanted it or not, "that I just got promoted to God because of a filing error?" "Minor deity," Zefrix corrected weakly. "And it's more of a temporary assignment pending proper classification review. The paperwork for divine reassignment typically takes anywhere from 3 to 5 millennia. The last thing she heard before the office disappeared entirely was the sound of the supervisor muttering about early retirement and the philosopher behind her, beginning what sounded like a very long complaint about cosmic inefficiency. Reality shifted, twisted, and delivered her to a mountaintop throne room on a world she'd never seen, to rule over aliens she'd never met, armed with divine powers she definitely hadn't asked for. Somewhere in the processing queue, Zefrix made a note in his files. Recommend immediate policy review regarding unclassified species. Also recommend hazard pay for unusual cases. The note would be filed, processed, and eventually reach the appropriate committee in approximately 2,000 years. Divine bureaucracy, it seemed, moved at its own pace. Waking up as a god, it turns out, comes with the universe's worst case of sensory overload. The first thing she noticed wasn't the crystalline throne that had somehow molded itself to her form, or the vast chamber carved from what appeared to be a single enormous geode. No, the first thing that hit her was the voices. Thousands of them, all speaking at once in a language that her newly divine consciousness translated automatically. "O Great One, bless our harvest of ground nuts. Divine Mother, my offspring has developed a concerning rash. Merciful Goddess, the weather has been too pleasant lately. Surely this means doom approaches." She opened her eyes to find herself perched on a throne that would have made ancient pharaohs weep with envy, overlooking a world that looked like someone had taken Earth's most pleasant countryside and cranked the saturation up to 11. Rolling hills covered in what appeared to be purple grass stretched to horizons painted in shades of orange and gold, and, scattered across this landscape like fuzzy boulders, were the Fluffingtons. Zephyros hadn't been kidding about the rodent resemblance. They looked like someone had taken a hamster, scaled it up to human size, given it opposable thumbs, and dressed it in what could generously be called medieval religious garb. Currently, several hundred of them were prostrated before her mountain temple, their prayers creating a constant background hum in her expanded consciousness. At the moment, the rodent created an unconscious... "Okay," she muttered, her voice now carrying enough divine resonance to make the crystal walls chime softly. "Think, Marine, assess the situation. You're apparently a god now. These are your worshippers? Subjects? Whatever. They're praying for stuff. Gods grant prayers, right? How hard can it be?" She focused on the nearest prayer, something about blessed ground, nuts, and tried to channel whatever cosmic power was supposedly at her disposal. The result was immediate and spectacular in all the wrong ways. The Fluffington farmer's modest ground nut patch exploded into growth, producing vegetables the size of small buildings. The farmer, who had been expecting perhaps a 20% yield increase, found himself face to face with a ground nut that could have doubled as emergency housing. His grateful squeaks of terror echoed across the valley. "Well, that's not right," she observed, watching the farmer attempt to flee from his own blessed crop. "Maybe I need to dial it back a bit." The next prayer involved the offspring with the rash. She tried for a gentler touch, focusing on healing rather than raw power. The young Fluffington's skin condition cleared up beautifully. Unfortunately, the divine energy also gave him what appeared to be prophetic visions, which immediately sent him into religious ecstasy and prompted him to begin preaching about the end times. By the third prayer, a request for better weather, she'd managed to accidentally create a localized aurora that painted the sky in spectacular patterns, while simultaneously causing all the local wildlife to begin singing in harmony. The Fluffingtons were convinced this was either the most wonderful miracle in their recorded history or a sign that their new goddess was completely insane, possibly both. "This is like trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer," she grumbled, watching a flock of local birds execute what appeared to be synchronized aerial maneuvers. "Where's the user manual for this thing?" As if responding to her frustration, her divine consciousness suddenly expanded, connecting her to the broader cosmic information network. She found herself accessing the Divine Orientation Package, a comprehensive guide to godhood that had apparently been compiled by beings with far too much time on their hands and a disturbing fondness for flowery language. According to the manual, proper divine intervention required gentle communion with the cosmic forces, allowing one's benevolent will to flow through the universe like a river of starlight. It was, she noted with growing annoyance, written by someone who had clearly never been shot at. The Fluffingtons, meanwhile, had begun to organize themselves into what appeared to be competing theological interpretations of her recent miracles. One group insisted that giant vegetables were obviously a sign of divine abundance. Another faction argued that the prophetic offspring indicated imminent cosmic change. A third group had decided that the singing birds were the voices of their ancestors and began constructing elaborate shrines in their honor. "Great," she muttered. 5 minutes into godhood, and I've already started a theological schism." Her divine awareness also brought disturbing news from beyond her new world. The war she'd died in was still raging, and it wasn't going well for humanity. Her former unit, the ones she'd died protecting, were being systematically ground down by an enemy that seemed to have unlimited resources and a complete disregard for civilian casualties. She tried to focus her new omniscience on the conflict, hoping to find some way to help. What she saw made her divine essence burn with very human anger. The enemy weren't just conquering territory, they were systematically destroying human culture, erasing entire colonies from existence as if they were cleaning up paperwork. "Those bastards," she growled, her divine voice causing minor earthquakes across 3 continents. The Fluffingtons immediately assumed this was another miracle and began composing hymns about the sacred trembling. She attempted to reach across space to the battlefield, to somehow intervene in the conflict. The result was a cosmic headache that felt like being hit by a freight train made of pure thought. Apparently, divine jurisdiction had limits, and interfering in wars on distant worlds was above her current pay grade. Instead, she found herself limited to observing helplessly as her former comrades fought and died against impossible odds. The frustration was overwhelming. She had cosmic power, but couldn't use it where it mattered most. A new wave of prayers interrupted her brooding. The Fluffingtons had apparently decided that their new goddess needed proper worship, and they'd begun constructing increasingly elaborate offerings. Someone had built a shrine entirely out of what appeared to be fermented fruit. Another group was attempting to sacrifice their finest ground nuts by catapulting them into the sky. A third faction had begun a ritual dance that looked like a cross between aerobics and a seizure. "Stop!" she commanded, her divine voice carrying across the entire continent. The Fluffingtons froze mid-dance, mid-catapult, mid-fermentation. "Look, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but we need to establish some ground rules here." She cleared her throat, which produced a sound like distant thunder. "First, no more fruit shrines. They're going to attract bugs. Second, please stop launching food into the sky. It's wasteful and someone's going to get hurt. Third, what I really need right now is coffee. Do any of you know what coffee is? The theological implications of a goddess requesting an unknown substance sent the Fluffington priesthood into overdrive. Within hours, they'd declared coffee a sacred mystery and begun dispatching expeditions to discover its divine nature. Their interpretation of her request would eventually lead to the development of a caffeine-based religion that would dominate their civilization for centuries. But that was still in the future. For now, she sat on her crystal throne, newly divine and thoroughly confused, watching her accidental followers attempt to decode the will of their inadvertent goddess, while the war she died in continued to rage beyond her reach. 5 millennia until the paperwork gets sorted out, she muttered, watching a Fluffington elder attempt to explain the concept of coffee to a crowd of increasingly excited worshippers. This is going to be a very long assignment. Below her, the Fluffingtons began to organize their first theological conference on the sacred mysteries of divine caffeine. Their enthusiasm was touching, if slightly terrifying. At least they weren't shooting at her. 3 weeks into her divine career, she'd learned 2 important lessons. Cosmic power didn't come with an instruction manual, and the Fluffingtons had an impressive talent for misinterpreting absolutely everything. The coffee situation had escalated beyond all reasonable bounds. Her offhand request had spawned a theological movement complete with rival denominations, sacred brewing rituals, and at least 4 separate holy wars over the proper temperature for divine beverage preparation. The high priest of sacred caffeine had declared that coffee must be a liquid form of enlightenment, while the orthodox bean seekers insisted it was clearly a test of faith, requiring them to search every corner of their world. "I just wanted something to drink," she muttered, watching through her omniscient awareness as 2 Fluffington armies faced off across a field, banners flying with emblems of steaming cups and coffee beans. How did this become a crusade? Her divine consciousness had grown more refined over the weeks, allowing her to multitask between managing her increasingly complex pantheon and monitoring the war that had claimed her mortal life. The news from the front lines grew worse daily. Human colonies were falling faster than dominoes, and her former unit had been reduced to a skeleton crew, making their last stand on some asteroid mining station. She had tried everything she could think of to help them. Subtle, divine interventions that skirted the edges of her jurisdictional limits, a convenient equipment malfunction in an enemy ship here, a fortuitous asteroid collision there. But the results were frustratingly minimal. Her divine power seemed designed for managing planetary ecosystems and answering prayers about livestock, not conducting interstellar warfare. The breakthrough came when she realized she was thinking about the problem wrong. Direct intervention might be off the table, but indirect support was apparently fair game. If she couldn't fight their war for them, she could at least make sure they had the tools to fight it themselves. Her first attempt at divine military aid involved manifesting supplies directly to the battlefield. The result was spectacular, if not entirely successful. Instead of the requested ammunition and medical supplies, her divine interpretation of what soldiers need produced a rain of what could generously be described as cosmic care packages. Energy bars that provided supernatural stamina, bandages that healed wounds faster than medically possible, and weapons that never seemed to run out of ammunition. Unfortunately, she'd forgotten about the whole mysterious ways aspect of divine intervention. The supplies materialized with glowing auras and accompanied by celestial music that could be heard for miles. Rather than accepting this as helpful divine aid, both sides of the conflict assumed they were experiencing some kind of shared hallucination brought on by combat stress. Her second attempt involved sending divine visions to her former squad leader, hoping to provide tactical intelligence. This backfired when the visions came complete with the full sensory experience of godhood, including the ability to hear every prayer from her Fluffington worshippers. The poor sergeant spent 3 days convinced he was having a psychotic breakdown, triggered by alien hamster voices discussing coffee theology. "This is harder than it looks," she admitted, trying to figure out how to dial down the cosmic special effects on her interventions. "Maybe I need to be more subtle." Subtlety, as it turned out, was not her strong suit. Her next attempt to help involved influencing the enemy's decision-making through divine dreams. The plan was sound: give their commanders nightmares about defeat, shake their confidence, maybe convince them to make some tactical errors. What she actually accomplished was introducing the entire enemy high command to the concept of existential dread. They began questioning not just their military strategy, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. Rather than making them cautious, this philosophical crisis made them even more aggressively destructive, as if they were trying to prove their existence through violence. Meanwhile, back on her divine world, the coffee wars had escalated. The Fluffingtons had somehow managed to split into 17 different sects, each with increasingly specific theological positions on divine beverage preferences. The disciples of Dark Roast had declared holy war on the followers of Light Blend, while the cream and sugar separatists insisted that any additive corrupted the pure essence of the sacred bean. At this rate, she observed, watching a Fluffington archbishop excommunicate an entire village for suggesting that tea might also be acceptable, I'm going to have more religious conflicts on my own world than there are in the entire galactic sector. The situation reached a breaking point when she discovered the true scope of the war she'd died in. Through her expanding divine awareness, she realized this wasn't just a human conflict, it was part of a much larger religious war. The enemy species she'd been fighting were themselves the chosen people of another deity, one who apparently viewed conquest and destruction as forms of worship. This particular god, who went by a name that roughly translated to "he who devours light," had been at the divine business significantly longer than she had. His followers had been spreading across the galaxy for millennia, converting or destroying everything in their path as offerings to their dark deity. "Ah, wonderful," she muttered, her divine senses picking up the psychic signature of her cosmic counterpart. "I'm in a religious war, and I didn't even know it." The enemy god's presence felt like standing too close to a black hole, all-consuming darkness and barely contained malevolence. Compared to her chaotic but benevolent energy, he was cosmic nihilism given form and purpose. Where she accidentally created theological schisms over coffee preferences, he deliberately fostered conflicts that consumed entire civilizations. Through the divine network, she could sense his attention turning toward her small corner of the universe. Her accidental ascension had apparently caught his notice, and he was less than pleased to discover a new deity operating without his permission in what he considered his expansion territory. A message arrived through channels that existed between dimensions, carried on waves of pure malice. "Surrender your followers and your world, little godling. Your brief reign ends now." The threat sparked something in her that was entirely human and completely at odds with proper divine behavior. She'd died once fighting these fanatics, and she'd be damned if she was going to roll over for their cosmic patron just because he had seniority. "Tell you what," she replied through the same dimensional channels, her message crackling with the kind of stubborn defiance that had gotten her killed in the first place. "Come and take them." Below her, the Fluffingtons suddenly stopped their theological arguments and began looking toward the sky with expressions of growing alarm. Their divine patron's mood had shifted, and even they could sense that something cosmic and unpleasant was heading their way. The coffee wars were about to become the least of their problems. War, it seemed, was one universal constant that didn't change much between mortality and godhood. The only difference was the scale of the stakes, and the fact that now she had an entire planet of oversized religious hamsters counting on her to figure out how to win a fight against a deity with several thousand years of experience. "Well," she said, settling back into her crystal throne and feeling divine power coalesce around her like armor, "at least this time I know it's coming." Somewhere in the cosmic distance, ancient evil began moving toward her small corner of the universe, bringing with it the promise of the kind of divine conflict that typically reshaped entire galactic regions. The Fluffingtons began to pray with unprecedented fervor, though they were still arguing about the proper theological significance of cream versus sugar. "He who devours light" arrived with all the cosmic subtlety of a supernova having a temper tantrum. The enemy deity manifested above her world as a writhing mass of shadow and malice, his presence turning the cheerful orange sky the color of dried blood. His voice resonated across dimensions with the authority of eons. "Kneel, pretender, and I will grant your followers a swift extinction." "Counter-offer," she replied, rising from her crystal throne with divine energy crackling around her like contained lightning. "Go back where you came from, or I'll show you exactly how humans handle workplace harassment." What followed was the universe's most destructive theological debate. He attacked with waves of cosmic despair designed to crush her will. She responded with concentrated human stubbornness that had been refined by military training and amplified by divine power. Where he wielded existential dread as a weapon, she countered with the kind of aggressive optimism that had driven humanity to colonize hostile worlds out of pure spite. The traditional Divine Combat Manual apparently assumed both participants would engage in ritualized displays of power, cosmic posturing designed to establish dominance without actually destroying the local galactic cluster. Her opponent had clearly read this manual, she had not. While he who devours light was executing what appeared to be a formal challenge of primordial authority, complete with ominous monologuing about the inevitability of darkness, she flanked him through a dimensional fold she'd noticed during his speech and hit him with the divine equivalent of a sucker punch. "Rule 1 of warfare," she announced as her cosmic haymaker sent him reeling across 3 star systems. "Never give your enemy time to set up." The battle that followed would be studied by cosmic theologians for millennia, assuming anyone survived to write theology textbooks. Traditional divine combat involved careful exchanges of philosophical principles, made manifest as reality-altering forces. Her approach involved whatever worked, including several moves that violated both the Geneva Convention and the fundamental laws of metaphysics. When cosmic blasts failed to penetrate his defenses, she tried psychological warfare, flooding his consciousness with every profanity she'd learned during basic training. When that didn't work, she grabbed him with pure telekinetic force and introduced him to the concept of a divine headbutt. The clinching moment came when she realized something her ancient opponent had overlooked. She was still connected to her human origins, including the war that had killed her. Through that connection, she could channel not just her own will but the collective determination of every human who'd ever refused to surrender against impossible odds. He who devours light found himself facing not just one stubborn goddess, but the concentrated essence of human military history. Every last stand, every impossible victory, every moment when humanity had looked at certain death and decided to charge anyway. The cosmic scream that erupted from him as this realization hit could be heard across 17 dimensions. "I yield!" he howled, his ancient arrogance finally cracking under the weight of weaponized human obstinacy. "Smart choice," she replied, then proceeded to demonstrate why accepting surrender from humans required reading the fine print. The merger of their 2 pantheons wasn't gentle. She systematically absorbed his cosmic authority, redistributed his followers to more reasonable deities, and installed herself as supreme goddess of the local galactic region. His species of conquering fanatics suddenly found themselves compelled to take up peaceful occupations like gardening and interpretive dance. The war that had killed her ended abruptly when the enemy forces received divine visions instructing them to pursue careers in customer service. Down on her world, the Fluffingtons watched their goddess's victory with appropriate awe, then immediately began theological debates about whether this meant coffee was now the supreme beverage of the entire universe. 6 months later, she sat on her considerably larger throne, fielding prayers from 17 different species, while simultaneously managing a cosmic empire she'd never wanted. Her former human unit, having survived the war thanks to suddenly peaceful enemies, was still listed as MIA, including her. Somewhere in the Celestial Administrative Office, Zephyric stared at reports of the most significant divine restructuring in galactic history and decided that maybe some filing errors were best left unfixed. The paperwork alone would take millennia, and in the growing quiet of her cosmic domain, a former marine-turned-accidental supreme goddess discovered that immortality came with one significant drawback: she was definitely never getting that coffee.